Good afternoon and welcome to our brown bag lunch. My name is Al Walters and I'm the program committee chairman. We now know approximately how many people fit into this room, especially with the tables up. All we have to do is announce a watch factory program, and this is the turnout we get. So thank you all for coming. I want to talk about a couple upcoming programs, please. Our next big event is Sunday, the 14th, July 14th, from 10 to 3 will be our annual car show. It'll be out front and all around the building. Last year we had 200 antique cars here. And weather permitting, we'll have that many or more this year. 10 to 3, Sunday the 14th. Our next brown bag lunch will be the Thursday, noon, on the 18th of July. Linda Rock will present the history of Lee Wars. Yeah. If you have you'll be another full crowd again. And that should probably make you do craft while you're there. If you haven't had a chance to visit the Nancy Kimball cobblestone yet, it's certainly up and running at 302 West Chicago. We have an art show in place over there right now. And on Sunday, August 4th, Sunday, August 4th, from 1 to 3, the artist, Steve Croix, will be at the cobblestone and explaining his work. And it's done with very intricate paper cutting and building. You'll be amazed at what you can do with a X-Acto computer and a paper. So that's 1 to 3. You can see the cobblestone, you can see his work. And we'll be back in August on the 15th for another brown bag lunch. This one is Gary Turnquist presenting on August 15th at noon. And it will be a look back at D-Day 80 plus years. But here. So that's the coming events. Today you're here to hear about a day in the life of a watch factory worker. And let me tell you a little bit about our presenters. Bill Briska is going to present. Many of you know him. Bill's a past president of the museum. He's a longtime board member. He's currently the treasurer. He's our expert on the watch company. He's also our expert on the mental health center. And Bill literally did write the book. Well, on the watch factory, along with Mr. Al.
Don't forget Mr. Al.
Mr. Al. And if you're so inclined, this book is for sale at the gift shop downstairs by the front door. And it is the definitive history on the watch factory. Rebecca is our educator. She's on staff here, and her job primarily is to shepherd the school groups and youth groups through here and do teaching. Although she doesn't let her job description stop her. She does anything and everything here in the museum, whether it's education related or not, including once in a while helping to present a program. So you've got two of our very best today. So let's learn about a day in the life of a watch factory worker.
So we're going to pitch the self-winding watch exhibit edition. Ooh. So for those that see the watch exhibit down at the other end of the hall, we just added a little piece to it having to do with automatic watches, which are self-winding watches, that wound off of the movement of your wrist. So there's just a couple of display cases on that, newly added with watches and expertise lent by a friend of ours, Max, and tell me his last name, Liz. Oh, yes, of course, Max Michelson, yes. When you get old. So, okay, Rebecca, oh, yeah.
Yes, no, I've got a mic, so you can keep that one. We'll turn that one off.
Turn that one off.
Because you have one too.
Yeah, I have one too.
Yeah.
I'll turn this on, try not to snore.
Parts?
All right.
Snort for your own parts.
Whoa.
Now, before we get started, we thought it might be fun just by show of hands. How many in the crowd own an Elgin watch? Oh, look at all those hands. That's right. Yay, good for you. There are 60 million out there. So, but we still think you're special for owning one. And now by show of hands, how many of you have a personal human connection to the watch factory? Somebody worked there, family members? Awesome. And we still see that a lot in town. A lot of people still can proudly tell us about their family that worked at the watch factory. So final question, how many of you, when the watch factory closed down, went beyond the gate and poked around a little bit and got yourself a brick or a piece of glass? No, just one? All right, so we're gonna talk today about a day in the life of a watch factory employee. You already met us, Bill and Rebecca. And when we talk about the watch factory, our exhibit's just down the hall. So hopefully you'll catch a glimpse of that when you are done today. But the purpose of our presentation today is we often hear from community members like yourselves. One of my relatives worked at the watch factory and I never thought to ask them about their job. And they thought it was just an ordinary day-to-day thing. And they never told me what it was like to work at the watch factory. So we think that this program will answer some of those questions for you about what it was like to work at the watch factory. And if this is your first time learning about the watch factory, just to level set, here in Elgin, we talk about it quite a bit in certain circles. But if you are brand new to the Elgin National Watch Company, it's your lucky day because it's one of our favorite topics here at the museum. The Elgin National Watch Company did make over 60 million pocket and wrist watches. And their lifespan was over 100 years. So the company had a huge presence in Elgin, and the quality of the watches, oops, sorry about that. The quality of the watches was well known. And really today we also hear from family historians who often say it's their favorite family heirloom that might get passed down to them. So maybe some of you who own Elgin watches know exactly who they used to belong to. And that's a special thing. So we're going to focus on the employee experience today. We're going to talk about the factory itself, how employees were hired. We're going to go over the rules of factory life because the factory ran just like a well-tuned watch. And we're going to go over the perks and problems that those employees saw. And of course, some job descriptions. But a small disclaimer, our presentation cannot cover everything. The Elgin National Watch Company was in business from 1864 to 1968. So some of the facts and statements that we're going to give you today are snapshots in time. They're references to a certain unnamed time period. But we're going to make generalizations and skip a few things, but we think altogether you'll get a good picture of what it was like to work at the watch factory. And of course, Bill's book goes into everything in detail, so you can fill in the gaps by reading the book. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's start with a description of the factory itself. So the factory was located along the Fox River at the modern day intersection of National Street and Grove Avenue. Its front entrance faced Grove Avenue. It never really had an address. They didn't need to know, I guess. People just knew where it was. In fact, there is a famous story about somebody drawing a picture of a pocket watch on an envelope and mailing it to us, mailing it to Elgin, and it got here. So it was well known. Today, we will see at that site a Butera grocery store near the National Street Bridge. The original factory was light colored brick with a limestone trim. It had a 144-foot tall, 4-sided clock tower. And we'll see a picture of that in a moment. The 14-foot diameter clock faces would dominate the front facade after 1905. Inside was a 2,500-pound bell. We have that on our grounds just outside. I hope you noticed that on your way in. The illuminated clock faces could be read from a half mile away on a clear night. And the numbers on the clock face were 3 feet tall. What do you think, taller or shorter than the Big Ben watch clock face in London?
Bigger.
Ours were bigger. Ours are bigger. Big Ben only had 2-foot numbers. Sorry, Ben. So we have the clock workings in one of the hands inside, and we have the bell outside today. Not just today, always. The watch factory would come to span a plot of 15 acres along the east side of the Fox River. It would have 4 stories and 20 acres of indoor floor space. And most of the workers sat at rows and rows of large benches. You're going to see some pictures of all of this, I promise. They mostly sat in front of large windows. And those benches would total 2.5 miles in length. The building at its peak would house 4,370 employees. And if you went inside, you'd see a multitude of departments that we're going to talk about in a minute. But we'll just make note of the 60,000 machines inside the factory and the on-site power plant. that unloaded 40 tons of coal per hour in 1905. Electricity was installed in the factory in 1889, and it soon would have 20,000 light bulbs. There was employees that could afford to drive to work, and by 1930s, it had a parking lot. And they also had room for 650 cars. And by the 1940s, the lunchroom could seat 1,000 workers. This was the largest watchmaking complex in the world. Elgin really only had one competitor of this size, which was the Waltham, Massachusetts American Waltham Watch Company. Okay, so now as promised, a lot of words on this slide, not so much coming up now. We got lots of great pictures. We're lucky to have a lot of great pictures of our topic today. But Bill is going to run us through the changes in the building itself, which kind of mirror the growth of the company.
Oh, wow, I didn't know I was gonna do that.
You, yes, you did.
All
You
right,
can use my notes.
let's see. I have to turn this thing on first. Okay. Also sound check. Is it going through? Bring it up more. It's a little wobbly, you know. So we don't want to screw around too much with it. Well, of course, the company started in 1864, but that was just incorporation, and they spent about 3 years building the machinery. Well, they were building the plant down on down there. Is that it? Yes, Liz? No? Okay, all right, so where's,
You're,
all right, so here's the 1865 plant, and it was designed obviously with that little blank on the left side so that it could be a large, which it was just a few years later. And then a front section architecturally mimicking the back section was added in 1873. And that was also then later on enlarged. And then after the 1900, they began to tear down most of the front of it and rebuild it into an even bigger and grander structure. This is the building that most people remember. I think it was 21.3 acres of floor space inside the plant at the end of that. So this was the facade that most of us remember, and that's where the Grand Watchtower was. Here's another view of the plant. And then in this aerial view, which is coming right up, you could see it again, and you see it on the east side. They had already, at the time this picture was taken, they had already removed some of the wings there that were obsolete by the 1950s. And so
National Street here and the bridge, right?
yes.
Yep.
Yes,
Trying
you
to
are.
give some points of reference.
Okay, so there's the grand plant. You want to go into factory rules?
Yeah, let's do the factory rules. Any good factory is going to have rules, especially one that makes timepieces, and they want to make sure that they're making quality products. So they had rules that were similar for all factories at the time. We're going to look at some of the rules as published for employees in 1879. Regular hours of labor are 7 a.m. to 12 noon and 1 to 6 p.m. The factory ran a 6-day work week at this time, 1879, but there were changes later. By 1917, the watch factory was at a modern 8-hour, 5-day-a-week schedule like we would expect today or hope for today, right? Notice the 1-hour lunch break. Most employees went home for lunch. They had that full hour and they could easily walk home or take the streetcar. But in the 1940s, the lunch hour was cut to 30 minutes, and that was not enough time to go back and forth for lunch. So the on-site lunchroom was built. There was also a lot of eateries within walking distance of the watch factory. So in the early years, the workday was signaled by a factory bell, which was rung at 6 a.m. 78 times to wake you up, right? And then it was rung again 30 minutes later to remind you to come to the factory. So that's a lot of bell ringing. But later on, they moved to a steam whistle, which you can see in our exhibit down the hall. And that was, I'm sure, maybe a little less abrupt, right? So the engines start promptly at the allotted time, or the marked time. And if you don't arrive at work on time and are in your seat ready to go, your pay will be docked. And also, if you arrive late to work, you might find the front doors locked. This was serious business. You were glad to have this job and they expected a good day's work out of you. Also, employees were not permitted to leave work or to begin tidying up. Teachers know about how kids like to tidy up before the bell rings. You weren't permitted to tidy up until the quitting bell rang. Okay. Rule number 2, 10 minutes are allowed every Saturday for cleaning. This is the finishing department, and I don't know if 10 minutes is enough time for these fellas, but we'll hope. Rule number 3, visiting other departments is not permitted. At the watch factory, the watches are made assembly line style. So each department does one small special task, and then the watch assembly is moved along to the next department. No one department makes an entire watch. This is different than how watches were made traditionally, like in Switzerland. So you'll notice the wooden trays in the circle there stacked up in front of the workers on their workbench. These wooden trays had circular indentations. You can see an example here on our table, and each held one watch assembly, like an egg carton. And the trays moved around the factory from department to department. So there was no reason for the employees to move around. The watches moved around. Rule number 4, smoking in the factory or on the grounds is prohibited. Now, fire was always a big risk for any industrial environment at this time in history. This is 1879 again. And certainly no automatic sprinkler heads like we have today. They would have fire buckets hanging above the workstations. And later on by 1900, they had their own in-house fire brigade. And we have a picture of the fire brigade and the workers who watched out for the fires. There was an accommodation made to the no smoking rule. Men who wished could chew tobacco. It was permitted on the factory floor, but you were charged a spittoon cleaning fee, came right out of your paycheck. You can see here on this statement of deductions for this worker's pay stub, there's a 50-cent cuspidor cleaning fee. It is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. You gotta, yeah. Maybe you could share with your neighbor, maybe you could share with your work. Yeah, probably. Later, the rules were changed to allow ladies to chew gum for free. I bet for free, probably. Yay, ladies. Rule number 5. Employees may not throw water, trash, or paper out the windows. As you see here, I'm sure the temptation was there because they all sat in front of the large windows for natural light. But they, of course, did not want you throwing things into the courtyard. You saw those, how the buildings were laid out, lots of courtyards. They didn't want any trash out there. Also interesting with those big windows, by 1904, the windows were frosted to prevent daydreaming. Was that only on the riverside though? Was that only the riverside?
I do not know.
Yeah. Well, certainly some people had a really good view. They got the view of the river,
I
right?
daydreamed all through grade school.
You turned out all right.
Things like that. Yes.
You turned out all right. Okay, rule number 6. Absences must be requested of the foreman. Many employees reported being quite intimidated by their foreman. This was not a time in history where your boss was your friend and wanted to hear about your weekend, but you must request time off from your boss, the foreman. Rule number 7, employees will not admit any persons not in the employ of the company into the factory. Now, why is this? Were industrial spies a risk? We said just a moment ago that the number 2 manufacturer of watches in the country was the Waltham Company in Waltham, Massachusetts. Were they sending spies to Elgin? I don't know. I will tell you that some of our first watchmakers we stole from Waltham. So maybe that went on in the industry. But that wasn't really the reason for this rule. The real reason for this rule was if visitors were to come through the factory, this happens today, right? Everyone's like, well, who's that guy? As employees would turn and look, they stopped what they were working on. And the newspaper at the time in 1904 later would say that $300 was cost to the watch factory every time some looky-loo came through the factory and the employees paused to get a look at it. So this was another way of keeping production up. Rule number 8, quiet and orderly deportment is required at all times. This is a March 1923 ledger page which details the reasons for some recent dismissals. Now, I've blocked out the names, the last names of the people, because I don't know if these are your grandparents, and I'm not here to, we're not here to talk about that. But notice some of the reasons for dismissal, okay? We see dismissals for poor work, and we see some dismissals for theft. Somebody was mailing parts to themselves, starting their own little watch business, I guess. But notice the people fired for expressing a political allegiance one up here near the top, somebody is pro-German, and in, when did I say this was? 23, so, and then we have an auto theft, obviously in their off time, but still did not, was not good for the image of the watch factory. Being undesirable, quote unquote, and one that was discharged at her husband's request. And all I got to say about that is she was making good money, and I don't know why he would want that, because she was making good money. Okay, so why did the watch factory have so many rules? Tell us about what it was like to be a factory worker anywhere.
Well, it was tough. The factory life was tough. And you were taking, Elgin was basically a farm supply town in the 1860s. It did not really have a factory kind of mentality about it. So you were taking people that were new to factory work, especially ladies, and you had to mold them into the workforce that you needed. And they were strict about that. And they also, over time, beefed that up quite a bit. This is in the 19th century. Remember, there were no work rules and all that. And, oh, the mic's not on? That's what you're telling me, Liz?
I think the volume is perfect.
Yeah, but you're 20 feet ahead of those people. See, this thing's going like this.
Good.
And here in the back,
This is my Jimi Hendrix. Anyway, so let us go on to the job description. I'm going to get back to the importance of the workforce vis-a-vis the company's success and how the company's relationship with the workforce changed over time.
But we're gonna look at some of the job descriptions, some of the departments that the watch factory had, and the steps of making a watch. First, we're gonna just take a quick look, no vocabulary test, but if you've ever opened up the back of a pocket watch that you own, or you've seen a photo like this, there are lots of pieces inside of a pocket watch. We also have some things here that might show you some of those pieces. But in short, there are more than 100 parts to a pocket watch, and many gears and wheels and screws and one very long mainspring that's tightly coiled up in there. And all of them are necessary for the operation of the watch. It takes about 6 to 9 months to manufacture a watch, and requires about 3,100 operations and 1,000 inspections. So obviously a lot of people involved, and we're going to see just a few of those job types, job departments. Just a few that we're going to look at with some great photos, okay? So this photo is of the plate department. If your watch is a house, the plate is the roof and the floor, okay? And the parts of the plate that hold the structure together in between is the gears that make up the pocket watch. So the plate is made up of several metal plates, complete with drilled holes and countersunk posts and depressions where all the gears go in. And it's engraved with the model number and the company name and some elaborate scroll work. And this was the department that produced those plates. Now notice the belts above the workstation. When the factory was powered by steam in the early years, these belt-driven systems were what turned those machines to make the different parts. Here we have the screw department. The screw department made each of the screws used in the assembly of a pocket watch. They made over 1 million screws a month, okay? A common thimble, which we have an example on the table, would hold 25,000 of these screws. If you were to spill these screws on a table, which I have done during a field trip, Al see me, was not on purpose, but they look like dust on the table. You can't even tell what they are. We have some examples that you can look at when after our presentation today. But the size of the screws indicates the precision of the machinery. So this was the department that made those screws. Next department that we can see here is the dial department. I think you all know what the dial of a watch is. It's the top part, the part you see and the part you tell the time on. It's a thin circular plate of copper. It has an enamel face that's baked and then sanded for smoothness. And then next, a team of women, such as the ones in the picture here, with very steady hands, would paint the numbers around the edge. And then a final painter would come back with a camel hair brush and paint the name of the company on the watch in beautiful cursive script. The entire name of the company, which is a long one, Elgin National Watch Company, would be 3/4 of an inch long. So this is quite skilled work. A skilled painter can complete a watch dial in 5 minutes. Now, this was obviously something that they did improve on for efficiency's sake later on in the corporate history. So by the 1880s, they weren't doing it that way anymore. They moved on to printed dials just for less of a labor-intensive process. Here we have the Escapement Department. The escapement is the mechanism that controls the transfer of energy from the power source inside the watch, which at this time in history is that tightly coiled mainspring. Remember, every day you're turning that knob on the top of your watch, or you're sticking the key in the back and you're turning it. And what you're doing is you're winding up that mainspring. And then the escapement, which is all those gears, they're controlling how fast that spring uncoils. And that's what tick, 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 tick. That's the escapement being controlled. That's the mainspring being controlled by the escapement. And that's what you hear when you hold a pocket watch to your ear. As it slowly uncoils all day, the hands turn. This is the jeweling department. Watches are made up of rotating gears that sometimes interact with each other. And in some instances, those metal gears, as they rub against each other all day long for your long life of your watch, they can cause a friction. And so it might be necessary to separate those gears. And that can be done with very very thin pieces of real gemstones, rubies, garnets, and sapphires cut into like a donut shape. They're deep inside the watch. You don't see them. They're not there for beauty or value. They're there to help the watch because they are stronger than metal. So as the friction of those turning gears goes all day long for decades, those jewels protect the metal because the jewels are harder than the metal. Okay. So in this 1896 photo, the jeweling department is decorated with American flags to commemorate the election of a recently elected president who was very pro-business at this time in history. 1896, anyone know? Yeah. McKinley, that's right. We got a school named after him, right? This is the machine department. The machine department produced the dies, jigs, bits, and files used in all the machines. The department used approximately 10,000 pounds of steel each year in manufacturing the equipment. This is the train department. This is the largest and most pleasant department, some said. This was a work department where they would use a machine on their work table to cut thin sheets of brass or gold into the gears that are known as wheels. And each one of those wheels might have 60 to 80 teeth. You can see some of those when you come up to the table. And an employee could cut 1,200 wheels a day. So obviously we're cranking out a lot of pocket watches here at the Elgin National Watch Company. This is the materials department in 1929. This department was responsible for obtaining the supplies needed by the factory. They were obviously very meticulous and good with detail as they thought to label their photo with a typewritten label with their full roster of names on the back. So we're glad for that. Historians love that. This is the timing and adjustment department. This is the department that completed the watches and guaranteed that they were accurate. The employees of this department are the only ones who can correctly be called watchmakers. Under this new assembly line system, different from what they did in Switzerland, under this new assembly line system where every employee does one small job, this is the only department where these men knew every part and then made sure that it came together correctly in a quality pocket watch, a quality timepiece. They're also, this is where the dial joins the rest of the assembly and the final product is checked for accuracy and performance and heat, cold, and various positions. Kind of a faded picture, but this is the Blacksmith Department in 1899. One of the things that made the watch factory so impressive is that they were making the finished watch assemblies, but also the component parts that went into those assemblies. As Bill mentioned earlier, the watch factory began in 1864, and the first 3 years was spent making the machines that would make the watches. So obviously a department like this was very important, you didn't maybe see it in the finished product. For decades, the watch factory maintained departments that made tools, workbenches, and all the things necessary to keep the factory running. In addition to the departments that we saw, there were departments that made every individual spring and screw. A carpentry department built the workbenches and repaired the chairs. There were yardmen that took care of the grounds. There were plumbers, steam fitters, electricians that kept the machines running, and janitors kept the factory clean. There was an engraving department that engraved all the numbers and the scroll work on the rear plates of the watches themselves. There was a design department that created the new models, both from an artistic perspective and also engineering for the internal mechanisms. There was payroll offices, shipping and receiving, materials department, everything that you might imagine in a little, all the little things that go into a pocket watch. This video I'm not going to play for you because it's on display right in the exhibit. There is a great video on the internet called The House of Wonder. It was made in 1931. It's a black and white silent film where you can, it's got pop-up title cards and music played in the background, but nobody in the video, nobody in the movie talks. And it's about how to make a watch from start to finish. It was made in 1931 as some type of promotional or industrial film, and it goes over the entire steps of how to make a pocket watch. It's about 23 minutes long. We played on loop in the exhibit, or it's on YouTube under the name House of Wonders. Their name, not ours, although we do think it's pretty wonderful. Okay, so that's the House of Wonders again. And so let's talk next about, we've seen the departments, but how do you get a job in these departments? So let's go through the hiring and the pay. Notice the 1888 trademark in the corner. It's a Father Time who has cast away his familiar hourglass for a more reliable option, an Elgin pocket watch. So this is the logo that a lot of us see. We talk about Elgin timepieces from this era, and that's what led the employees to be known as Father Time's family. You tell me when you want to jump in for the part that you mentioned.
Just roll a couple of it.
All right. You know how to stop me.
Yeah.
If anyone can, you can. First, as we saw in the earlier department photos, the watch factory always hired both men and women. And throughout its history, there was about equal numbers of both. Women were sought out for work where their thinner, smaller hands, more nimble fingers were at an advantage. And within each department, there were roles assigned by gender, though. Women may be the workers, but men were going to be the supervisors. We can't rewrite history. This is just the way it was at this time in history. The only exception to every department having female employees, the only department that was male only was the machine department, which was a little bit more of a dirtier, industrial environment. In this chart, we see some of the employee counts. So we noted earlier that 1926 was the year in which employment numbers peaked. And they also always had a good split between men and women. And as the company grew, so did the numbers of both groups. An interesting note up there in the top corner is to compare Elgin's working women with the state average. So in 1909, Elgin's workforce was 39% female. Statewide, that number was 16%. So our number in Elgin was more than Chicago's and more than the state average. If you look at Elgin's total population in 1930, we can say that about 10 to 12% of the town worked at the watch factory. If you take out children and the elderly, that's a pretty impressive number. And we really do say that the factory really was the heart of Elgin at that time period. So how did you become an employee of the watch factory? You could just walk in sometimes. They had those signs on the fence when they needed employees. Sometimes you might get a referral from a family member or a friend. In the 1920s, there were tests that prospective employees had to take. So they began to be a little bit more restrictive with who they accepted, right? So in the 1920s, workers were given a series of aptitude tests. These are common really in a lot of factories at the time period. And they were designed to measure things particular to the manufacturing process. In our case, it was going to be eyesight, dexterity, and precision. So one test was kind of like the modern day game of operation. You had to take a stylus and move it along a wire. And if you touched the wire, it buzzed. And obviously you weren't very precise and didn't have good control of your digits, I guess. Another machine involved testing the sensitivity of your fingertips. Women were expected in the balance department to install 4,000 screws a day. So if you had sausage fingers that you had burned on the stove back home, maybe you weren't cut out for the screw department, right? Because remember, those screws are so tiny, they look like dust. And finally, there was the Scott's mechanical test, which was a measure of hand-eye coordination. So there was a stylus, like a pen, a stick, and a board with 3 holes. And the prospective employee was told to poke the stylus into the holes in a prescribed order to the steady beat of a metronome. Okay? The test was designed to see how you might do in the rhythmic environment of a factory. Can you handle all day long? That's what they were doing with these machines when they were punching dies and things. So that test saw if you were good at that. And also, of course, an eye test. Got to have one of those when you work at a watch factory. But what about the pay? So once you were hired, the pay structure was typical for factories of the time. In the early years, the pay was a piecework system. The more you produced, the more you were paid. Only the foremen, machinists, inspectors, and the very newly hired got paid under a different system than piecework. Employees were paid once a month until 1866, when it went to 3 times a month. To their credit, the watch factory only missed payroll 1 time in 1871. Anybody might guess why they might have missed payroll in 1871? The Great Chicago Fire. Yeah. So that's excusable, right? Yes, we give them credit for that one. Some deductions from your paycheck might include union dues, contributions to the Employee Aid Fund, which was an early form of employee and employer-funded disability insurance. And in the early years, you might see use of recreational equipment or lodging, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And of course, don't forget that cuspidor cleaning fee. So even though they were under the piecework system, workers could still expect to make a pretty steady wage because the factory ran smoothly without interruptions. They had a steady clientele. In 1899, the average daily wage for the women was about $1.25 per day. Men could expect to make $2.50 to $2.75 per day. Holidays and days off? No, none of those. And they were unpaid if there were any. And the work was generally steady, except in times of nationwide economic hardship. And that really affected all industries. And the factory might cut hours or mandate a full work stoppage. This happened several times during nationwide recessions, notably 1873, 1892, and of course, 1929. So just to talk a little bit specifically about the Great Depression, in 1930, the watch factory cut back from 4,500 employees to 1,100. They enacted a 3-day work week due to declining sales. The next year in 1931, there was a mandatory work stoppage for 3 months in the summer. In 1932, the work week was expanded back to 4 days a week, but the employee count fell to only 400, and many of them were on half-time. Employment numbers began to recover in 1934 and grew steadily until World War II. If you can read this text, I'll give you the highlights of it. The large letter on the left is a letter to employee Emma Shaney, dated December 22nd, 1931. It advised her that her employment was being terminated due to the worst depression in history. We also see on the other slip of paper a notice sent to other employees advising them of a pay cut effective on January 1st, 1931. So what about safety? Was the watch factory a safe place to work? So in short, yes, because when you make pocket watches, it is an orderly and clean environment. The product required that workers were precise and careful because of the expensive equipment and machinery and materials. Plus, the employees took a great deal of personal pride in their work. So all in all, this was a safe work environment. Few departments were messier than others, such as the Blacksmith Department, that's expected. But generally, the factory was clean and comfortable, and workers were considered an elite amongst local employees. After 1905, we saw that addition with the clock tower, the fancy facade on National Street. After 1905's addition, the building was well lit and ventilated, not air conditioned though, right? Not a good day for today. But it was well lit and ventilated. Big fans drove fresh air throughout the factory. The washrooms had hot and cold running water, soap and towels, and the entire factory floor was scrubbed weekly to avoid an accumulation of dust. All the air coming into the plant by 1930 was filtered and exchanged every 7 minutes. So some departments were noisy. But others were very much like a library, very quiet. Workers were not permitted to wear clothing that might give off lint. So no woolen sweaters, no scarves or anything like that, because that lint could get in the gears of the watch. But you could wear a cotton smock if you were cold. So all in all, not a bad environment. If you did happen to get sick, there was an on-site infirmary available, and there was a doctor and nurse on staff. What about your eyes, right? I think all of us want to know that it was bad for your eyes to work at the watch factory. So the factory did have ways to help employees with vision concerns. They were able to move some of the benches closer to the workers' eyes. They didn't have to bend over and get a bad back. They didn't have to look as far down. They moved a lot of the work up to shoulder level instead of waist level. Workers also reported taking breaks or doing something slightly different in their task list so they could give their eyes a little bit of an alternating break. Many employees wore a jeweler's loop, which gave them a magnifying glass right on their glasses. And by the 1950s, they had these binocular microscopes that were being used in some departments. The watch factory maintained that no employees suffered any loss of vision from the small work. Having so many employees in one place did raise some concerns. By 1911, remember we have a lot of women working at the factory. The factory found it necessary to protect the female workers from the crush of all the people moving in and out at the noon and quitting time exit jam. Women were squeezed and knocked against walls, being bumped hither and thither per the newspaper. So they had a solution, don't worry. The women were allowed to leave 4 minutes early in order to get out of the building safely, and later on they widened the staircases. So that 4 minutes doesn't sound like much, but a lot of people were trying to catch these streetcars. So 15 of these streetcars, maybe even more, would line up in front of the factory every day at quitting time. So that 4 minute head start really did give the ladies the first chance of getting on the first round of streetcars. So while many employees took those streetcars to work, many walked. This brings us to another safety concern. How do you safely get to work from the west side if you have to cross the train tracks? So in 1923, the watch factory erected a pedestrian walkway for the benefit of those walking to work from the west side of the river. You see it right here going over the train that stopped. As you can see, the steam trains would stop to take on water, and they blocked that National Street Bridge. Made a lot of workers late for work. So the watch factory installed this staircase for their safety. Also, so they weren't late, because if you're late, we can't make as many watches. We want them to be safe. We also want them to make a lot of watches. This was called the Golden Staircase, and it was torn down later, 1932, only there for about 10 years. Something like that. Can't go see it today, is the point of this. During the war years, let's talk a little bit about the war years, because people might wonder what the war years did for safety. The watch factory did work on some timing fuses, not a far stretch from the mechanics of making a watch. But the women in the department wore rubber shoes that were grounded. They wore goggles. They had a shield on either side of them for protection. And the live fuse was passed through a hole in that shield to the next worker. So no reported problems with that. Radium. A lot of people want to know about radium. The Radium Girls book by author Kate Moore does not mention or comment on the Elgin National Watch Factory. But it certainly, radium was a big topic in the 1920s. It was the wonder element. People thought it would give you energy, and it was found its way into water and food and treated inserts for your shoes. And so eventually we also found out, because of its illuminating properties, it was used for glow in the dark paint. So painting clock and watch faces was an issue in Orange, New Jersey, Ottawa, Illinois, and Waterbury, Connecticut. It didn't appear to be an issue here in Elgin, because Elgin did apply radium to watch faces beginning in 1914, but it was never really a big part of what they did. And by the 1930s and the 1940s, when the war work caused the watch factory to make more illuminated dials and airplane gauges for the war effort, the risks were well known. So they were able to take those precautions that they had learned from the girls in Ottawa and the girls in New Jersey. So In the 1930s, radium was only used in one department at the watch factory. The air was exchanged every 7 minutes through a ventilation system that included hoses and hoods in front of each worker. Each worker wore a smock that was not taken out of the room. Extra radium was stored in lead-lined containers, and there was no use of paintbrushes, only a pen. By the 1940s, when they turned to that war work and they began making the fuses and the glow-in-the-dark air and ship gauges, again, they knew all about it. And we can see from this 1944 article in the employee newsletter that they were on top of it. The workers in that department received daily physicals, and they also had an examination under special lighting to see if there was any radium on their person or their clothing. They had, again, those vented rooms. They washed their hands with a special soap. They had dedicated employees who handled the mixing of the radium. And all in all, with the small amount that was used and these protections, we've not heard that there was significant problems at the watch factory. Okay. So what were the perks and problems? So the last thing we have to sort of cover, because there's always going to be perks and always going to be problems with any job, right? So the first perk, did you know the watch factory had a rooming house? The National House was built in 1867, just 3 years after the factory, and it was a boarding house for employees. It had rooms for about 350 people eventually. It was right across the street. Certainly this was something that families who were sending their young adults out to work in the big city found comfort in. You could stay at the watch factory and you were charged for room and board. The watch factory had a large dining room that would seat 500 diners. They were well known for their elaborate menus, especially at the holidays. They had parlors for entertaining, a library, a gentleman's billiard room, and a barber shop. Women were not permitted in the billiards room, but gentlemen were not permitted on the tennis courts. I'm not sure why, but I guess there'd been, I don't know, was there an incident? I'm not sure. They also would have a large gymnasium on the 3rd floor. They had a large gymnasium that doubled as a ballroom, and it had a 3rd floor balcony for a running track. So for all of these perks, you would pay $4 a week for men, $3 a week for women. So women got a discount. More proper to say men were charged more because they ate more and they required more tidying up after, right? You do your presentation. You do your work. All right. Throughout history of the watch factory, there were numerous clubs and teams. So many people worked at the watch factory for so long. They formed a lot of special friendships, a lot of extracurriculars. They had bowling, basketball, baseball, biking, horseshoe clubs, 2 employee magazines, one of which is the Watchword, which ran from 1921 to 1956. We have a collection of the Watchword magazines upstairs. If you know anybody who was ever written up in the Watchword, we can check it out for you. Parties and social events were very common and a much appreciated perk. Watch factories employees participated in parades. They held department picnics and gathered for dances and concerts. The concerts and dances were held at the National House and later at Lord's Park Pavilion. Although those who worked at the watch factory were not encouraged to make social chit chat during the workday, they did make a lot of lifelong friends. And it was not uncommon for in the watchword, they'll be like, oh, Dorothy from the train department has married Bill from the escapement department. There was a lot of marriages, a lot of families, and they also had a lot of people worked a long time with their families. So women routinely ate picnic lunches in the woods south of the factory. Men may find their workstations decorated with rattles and diapers when they returned after the birth of a child. Just a friendly environment, employees have said. The watch factory had other forms of employee benefits that we see today. In 1888, they had an employee aid fund, which was that disability insurance. You paid into it 25 cents a month. And if you were absent from work, you received $1 a day, 60 cents for women. So Al and I do field trips together, and we have to give the kids something to spark their interest. So we foil a little bit sometimes. In 1913, they established a mortuary fund with a death benefit of $500 per employee. The watch factory had many employees that were able to participate for long-term. They could get they worked there for a long time, so they could get service awards. You could get a gold pin for 15 years. You could get a Lady or Lord Elgin watch for 25 years. Throughout the history of the company, they had 50 employees who had worked there for 50 years. That says a lot, right? Another really important benefit was this pension fund. In 1918, they established a pension fund, the second in the nation. The first being at the Armour meat packing plant in Chicago. And they also had employee stock ownership, tuition reimbursement, and wage bonuses. Sounds just like an ad on Indeed.com for a job today, doesn't it? So you could also submit suggestions to the company for changes to your job that might save the company money. And if they thought it was a valid change, you would be awarded a $50 addition to your paycheck, which these examples here are from 1951. And this individual was awarded it's Glenn Volpe of the train department. He suggested a machine modification. He got $50, which is today's $575. So that's not bad. So problems. Let's finish with some problems at the watch factory. Every place has problems, right? So the watch factory was a good place to work, but it had some problems. Longtime workers complained that they knew nothing about how watches were made. They only knew what they did. Some said the work was sedentary and monotonous. It also bothered employees that the employer expected proper conduct in their life when off the clock. Also, a lot of your friends and neighbors worked at the watch factory. So people knew your business, and the watch factory, you know, there's a little mix and mingle of the home life and the work life, because so many people work there and so did their neighbors and families. But let's talk about let's talk about discrimination just for our last slide. In terms of the women workers, we know that women were not promoted to foremen. There was only 2 women that became job masters. Departments with women workers had male supervisors, right? And women were also hired at the lowest pay jobs. Sometimes women were used to lower production costs. There was an example where they had an innovation in the dial painting room, and they found that they could replace 120 men with 12 women, because women would be charged less. Now, on the flip side of that, there were also instances where the men said, listen, you got to pay the women more, it's not fair. But that wasn't quite altruism. It wasn't, they just didn't want, they wanted everybody paid the same so they wouldn't get fired in favor of cheaper women. So we have instances of that as well. Women were also fired first when there was, economic downturns in the economy. Women were fired first under the assumption that their income was not primary for their home. We saw that slide earlier during the Great Depression. Women workers were amongst the first cut when there was any sign of trouble, right? We saw that Emma Shaney, how she got let go in the Great Depression. Emma Shaney, if you notice the address of where that letter was sent to, she lived at the National House. So not only did she lose her job, she got kicked out of her housing. Right, yeah, so. In regards to racial and religious discrimination, there was only one Black person, a man, who was ever employed at the Elgin National Watch Factory. His name was Benjamin Downs, and he worked for 38 years as a janitor at the National House. Jewish workers were not commonly hired either. We don't know if this was a formal or informal policy. The Illinois Watch Case Company, which was down on Dundee Avenue, across town, was owned and operated by a Jewish family. So it's possible that Jewish workers who were seeking a place for employment, they might have just naturally gravitated towards Illinois Watch Case. Or it could have been an unwritten rule. We don't know for certain. So in conclusion, what did Elgin mean? What did the watch factory mean to Elgin? I have bullet points, but I think you have bullet points too.
On the factory?
What did,
Well,
yeah.
Let me go back to just 2 or 3 points about how the company related to the workforce. And these are points where the companies, it sort of hinged whether they were going to succeed or not in terms of development. And one was in the 1870s. Now, Elgin got rolling in the 1860s, their first watch, 1867, and they went profitable in 1872, was their first cash dividend. And that sparked a whole lot of other companies to come into being, try to get going, cash in on this. Like in the late 19th century, about 25 companies were making jeweled watches at one point or another. And companies that you probably never would hear about anymore. Freeport, Rockford, Peoria, Springfield, in Manistee, Michigan, and several on the East Coast. But what happened is they had a recession in 1873 that crippled those companies temporarily or sometimes permanently. And in 1876, because Elgin was profitable and the recession was passing, they went down, and this is also during their building phase. They spent 6 months and 20 guys organized to completely study the whole factory, how it operated, where they wanted to go, and how they were going to improve the efficiency of the plant. And when they came out of that process, they really tooled up differently. They had that workforce disciplined at that point, but they began to really hone the manufacturing process down. And this is in the 1876 and on. And that led to a tremendous advancement in terms of productivity and cost savings, which allowed them to crush their competition. All these little companies that were coming up, because they could produce watches at a lower price than the competitors. And that kind of mentality persisted all the way through the late 19th century. And it was augmented by what was really the very heart of the company, the manufacturing part of the company, which was the machine tool department. And they developed machines that could take the work of 4, 5, 6, 7, 20, 30 guys out. And one machine would do that. By 1891, I mean, they had a couple of innovations where they were displacing with one machine, 20 workers, 30 workers, 40 workers at a time. And this, of course, was also at a time when people were on piecework, and those machines could turn out a lot more pieces. They only needed a few operators, but the operators weren't benefiting from the increased production of the piecework. Their wages were actually being cut back. And leading up to the Great Recession in 1892-93, the watch company had not raised wages in 15 years. And there was a lot of disgruntlement, first about machines replacing workers, second about the working conditions in general being a little oppressive, and third being that the people that were being displaced were, there's no compensation for it. There's no labor laws in effect at that point. Now, the 1890s, of course, were really tough times in America for the labor movement. And there's a lot of disruption in industries. And the watch company had a brief little walkout of employees in the 1890s. And it was the finishers were the guys that put the last touches on the watches and had the most clout. They walked off for a little bit of time. So up to that point, the management would have just said, "You're out of here, you're gone, get away from us." But the president of the company at that time was 78 years old, and an old style, hard-nosed guy. They replaced him. And they brought in a younger guy from their board, Charles Holbert, and he was not like Mr. Avery, who he was replacing. He's not one of these guys that was self-made, came up like that. Holbert came up in a silver spoon in his mouth, which meant he went to Yale, and which meant that in the 1890s, he was exposed to new thinking about employee management relations. And he came in with the idea that, look, it's ruinous for us to be at war with the employees. We're making money. We should let the employees in on this to some degree. And that's when they began to slowly bring in things like, take down the work week, take down the number of hours, make Saturday a half a day instead of a full day, eventually go to 8 hours, to bring in things like having the employee clinic on the grounds. Let me run through the list because it's quite considerable. Hey, that's what. Hey, Al, tell them I'm not here. So they went to the 9-hour day overtime pay, pension plan, 10% raise when they introduced the employee stock options, and that Halbert's philosophy, which proved to be very, very successful in the first few decades of the 1900s, was we're going to get the employees completely bonded to the company, and they were. And that made a very loyal and dedicated workforce. Whereas some of the other competitors like Waltham had constant labor problems that crippled them at various times through those years. So that was the other turning point in their labor relations situation. Then, of course, in the 1950s, as things began to go out of control, the board of directors was changed. A lot of arguing and fighting in the boardroom. Morale dropped off with that and that. So I'll go to there, and then that's my little bit on that part. But we want to wrap it up because it's almost done.
Anything else to add other than
So
Elgin was also we would potential to be a two-income family town. So there was more middle-class wealth, which you see in some of our great houses around here. Also, women working at the factory led to kind of like a femalization of the shops downtown, the things you could buy, more books. Women brought the lecturers to Elgin. We had Susan B. Anthony, Frances Willard, Jane Addams all spoke in Elgin because there was a lecture circuit that women encouraged. And also the city grew. A lot of our great housing comes from these worker booms. And the population just kept doubling, or it tripled between 1870 and 1890. So obviously the watch factory was a big driver in how our town as a whole grew. So that's all I had to add.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So questions?
Questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I'll just use my outside voice. Like attorney. About people that have worked there.
Yeah.
If I knew it. I didn't really think about it until you gave me a little time here, but I was a two-and-a-half apprentice in South Elgin, Illinois, and there were two brothers that worked there they're ex-watch factory employees. I learned some of the precision tricks of the trades from these guys, but the thing that your pictures brought to mind is, and those are the only two guys of 40 employees that came to work every day with a shirt and a tie.
Yes. Yes.
All these white shirts and the
Yeah.
coats and the things on some of the.
Yeah, they're looking good in these photos. Yeah.
So in the 60s, how come you guys are trip? That's why you work precision.
Yeah.
Precision people. That's how we should address. Okay.
Yeah, mindset. Yeah.
Like one other thing that I'll add is in the 60s, I'm sorry, in the 70s, I was drafted in the Army. I ended up working in munitions, and I had no idea what fuses were for, what was in them, but I did learn that Elgin Watch made hundreds of thousands of fuses.
Yeah.
Because you wanted to be able to rough handle these things and not blow yourself up. You wanted that fuse to experience either a spin or a step back, or something, so that it wouldn't go off until it was headed for its target. It's all the precision watch movements in there that made that possible. Hooray for Elgin.
Yeah, like the precision and all up from day one. But okay, we're going to order here.
Yeah, three of these come to mind. Number one, there is a replica clock tower off the Davis and the frontage road.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And you can tell me something about that. Secondly, what was the change in World War II to the manufacturing? And third, did they ever have a labor union? And what was the beginning of the end when they closed? There are business books out there that talk about Elgin Watch Company's paradigm, why they ended.
Yeah.
It is a part of business school to read about Elgin Watch's. So those are the three things. I would
Okay.
say.
Well, could I get the children's version first? Because like Al said, I do a lot with kids. So I'm going to give you the third grade version, and then Bill will give you the real version.
8th grade.
Here's what I tell the third graders. During World War II, the watch factory turned to war work, as a lot of companies were asked to do by the federal government. And so they focused on those war products. And then after the war, they had to sort of regain their technology, regain where the market was and where the technology was for their product. Guess who didn't turn to war work during World War II? Remember those Swiss who, they were still making watches. And so they didn't have to do any of that. Plus, that time in history is when the United States kind of goes to this disposable culture, right? We all know that our grandfathers' refrigerators lasted their whole life, and now we can't get a fridge to last 7 years in our house, right? So pocket watches, by that time, wristwatches, people didn't really expect to keep them forever anymore. And they wanted to throw it away when it broke. They didn't want to get it fixed. And they wanted a new one that was trendy. Those two factors, this is what I tell the third graders, wrap it up. That's the sum answer to the question. The 8th grade version.
Well, okay. It's too long to tell, but I did a lecture
See.
on why the watch company failed. And it's taped and it's on the museum's YouTube channel. It's about 90 minutes, and it traces their the flow of things starting in the 1920s. and all the factors that came into it. It's very interesting. It's very complicated. It is a great business school vignette to study on why it failed. And it failed for a number of reasons, multiple causation, of course, competition only being one of those.
And the tower on Davis, I think it was just built
okay.
by a fan, right?
No, so the tower in Davis, the guy that owns that factory, he-
Screw guy.
yeah, he put that tower up because he kind of really admired the company. Well, one day Liz and I are driving by there, and we went in and talked to him. And so he asked us to design those little signs that are out in front of it there. And so we had a nice little relationship with them, yeah. So that was it. When we did that, he wanted and we wanted to reinforce the values of the company, of the loyal, dedicated workforce that he wanted to reflect in his workforce.
That's wonderful. It's a beautiful thing to see there.
It's a interesting little oddity there is.
And then-
What was the third?
The
part?
unions,
The
yes.
union. Okay,
You got,
I'm sure they work well.
well, okay, so the union, the watch company's relationship with the unions is different than what you might expect. In the 1890s, the machinists organized, and they had a little bit more clout to go with things, as I said, with that. And then the AFL had a local that was trying to organize the plan, but there were this is all before the Wagner Act in the 1930s. So there's no rules about how you organize it. There's no collective bargaining. So during the company during the 20s set up the Employee Advisory Council, or words to that effect, blocking an exact name. And the employees selected that to be their collective bargaining agent, not the watch workers union at the national level, which was representing Waltham and some other companies. And that kind of stuck with it. They finally went into the National Watch Workers Union during the war. But it was not an adversarial relationship with the company for the most part. And even the Watch Workers Union was on board with Elgin's benevolence as a role model, almost all the way up to the end on that. So
I think Mark was the next one.
Mark, two simple answers.
yes and no.
Yeah, you get a choice on each of them.
Yes.
But the black and white film that you referenced. okay,
Yes.
Was that from the Elgin factory?
Mhm.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's a great film. I've watched it over and over again.
And the wonderful black and white photos of the different departments. Are people identified in any way, name-wise, in those pictures?
I've not seen a lot of them that are. We have a couple where like the materials department, they pasted their names on the back. A couple, if they came, depending on how they came to us, there's one, and we saw it in here where somebody had handwritten like 3 or 4 names off the side. It's hit or miss. I don't think that we have a roster. And the watchword doesn't go back to that same era. The watchword, the employee newsletter, employee magazine, that starts in 1921. So some of those photographs beginning in 1921 will tell you the names of the people, but prior to that, not a lot of it. Yeah.
Al?
Rebecca and I and others do this program for the third graders mostly about the watch back if you reference to. You heard the pay differential, the men and women a while back. I can tell you that the young ladies who are in third grade are righteously outraged. And the future of women's employees is in
Yeah.
good hands.
Kids are all right. They're gonna be fine. They don't like it when we tell them these
Get
things.
it? And they are mad.
All right, any other quickie comments or questions?
Who owned the building when it came down and why, where was preservation?
The preservations were yet to be found. And the company owned the building, when it came down. So. Nobody wanted, hey, they were tearing down downtown Elgin. It was urban renewal. What do you want this old obsolete building for? So, nobody had this vision of redevelopment
This housing.
like
guy-
you do. Yeah.
Housing guy can see some amazing condos.
Yeah, well, yeah, after you cleaned up the building and everything else. Okay.
I saw something in the back,
wait a
yeah.
minute.
How much in the black spot?
Oh, that's a very important part of the story. Which in the interest of time, I skipped. When when they went through their reorganization of the plant, they were able to slash the cost of a watch, depending on the model, 10 to 50%. That really took the wind out of all their competitors. In that. So a watch, the very top end watch in 1867 was $100. And that's just the movement.
Yeah, we have to sort of clarify this because we didn't go into great detail about it, but they were making the assemblies. And then you would go to the jewelry store and you would buy the assembly. You'd say, I want an Elgin, and then you'd pick out your case separately, and then the jeweler would put them together. So that's how we have so much variety in our cases.
All right, so what happens is that BW Raymond model, the top end model, 1867, $100. By the time they go through this thing in the 1870s, late 1870s, it's $39. Okay, so by the time you get to about 1907, you could find those top end movements for selling in the $15 or $20 range. You know, and so that's how far down things were going.
And if you got a Lord
But-
and Lady Elgin for graduation or Christmas, when do you think this was?
That's the 50s.
It says so here, $39.75.
Yeah. And these are fine wristwatches,
yeah.
top end. But remember, one of the things that caught up the Elgin was the cheap watch movement. They didn't make cheap watches, but that segment of the market grew, starting in the 1890s, and it became bigger and bigger. And Timex came to dominate that segment by the 1950s. It's all in that video I referred to about why the watch company failed. And so in the 1890s, or even in 1900, those cheap watches were called dollar watches. They cost $1. So by 1907, say, they cost $1.50. That's when the Elgin middle grade, not the top grade, the middle grade movements were costing about $9, $10. So you see the spread there. On that. So
Oh, let's go over here first, yeah.
I was watching at Algonquin Library, and they said that Brick used to build that building with some Dundee brick, which later became Hager Project.
I don't know. I don't know.
This building was
mean-
built with Dundee brick.
Yeah, I mean, Dundee brick was, Hager, they're all, that's a whole brick story. I don't want to speculate on.
Brick expert in the room, so.
By selling open market.
He- Yeah, but yeah, that's another part of the story. He picked up a couple of boxfuls when he was just a sales guy. He went out and sold them. Yeah, so sure.
There's another
Anyway,
hand over here. Yes. Oh.
go ahead.
Meeting your issues with them need to be the pensions.
Yes.
Remember that neighbors. There, how did they ever resolve that? We were-
Okay, so here's what it is, the late 60s, actually. So what happens is the company and the company's contributing, they set up a pension plan. This is 1920s. And the company's contributing money to it, the employees are contributing money to it. And that goes pretty good all the way up until the 1960s. Well, one thing is that in the late 50s, the pension fund is very well funded. It's so well funded that the government, that agency that oversees the pension, say, look, you don't need to put any more money into it. You got enough to handle all of your liabilities going forward. Which was a blessing for the company, because in 58, that's the last year they made a contribution to the pension fund. The company was having financial problems anyway. So what happens is, after the company, the watch company as we know it, folds and is merged in with another company and made into a third company, the pension fund is still out there. And the pension fund was owned by the company. That was clear all the way from word one. The company would own the pension fund, not the employees. But the employees felt this sense of entitlement, justification about what would happen to it. Well, the new corporate structure, Elgin National Industries, decided what they were going to do. They were going to honor the pension commitments, but they were going to do it like this. They're going to take that $32 million that was in the fund at the time, And they were gonna buy annuities from insurance companies to pay the employees. And those annuities would take up about $24 million. And they were gonna I think it was maybe even $20 million. And they were gonna pocket the remaining amount of money. Well, the employees, obviously, they were all riled up and kind of agitated about it, and they went to sue on it. And it went to suit in Kane County, went to suit in New York, where Elgin National Industries was headquartered. But ultimately, the employees were all given pamphlets when they went into the pension fund, and they were given updates over time saying that the company reserved the right to liquidate the fund and come up with an annuity on it. And so it was obvious that they could not win in court, and they made a little out-of-court settlement for those that were on pension. And those that weren't on pension, like this gentleman's parents, if you weren't to the pension yet, you got screwed because there was nothing for you. And if you were on the pension, you got a little modest increase, but all over time, inflation had eroded the value of the dollars that you were getting. And so it was a modest increase. It was a token. It was the best they could get. So, and that led to reforms in how pension funds are overseen by the government now. So that's the short version of that story.
Okay,
Anything else?
in the back. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
Was there any collaboration but field when it came to the manufacturing?
I don't know. Don't know that. Okay.
Rebecca and Bill will stay around. They'll answer questions.